They laughed when Graham Voss finished his house. Not because it was unfinished, not because it was cheap, because on the most expensive ridge in Sonoma County, where every home was built to look like a magazine cover, Graham had built something that looked like it wanted to survive instead of impress. No vaulted glass wall, no cedar-clad gables, no dramatic balcony hanging over the canyon, just thick, earth-colored walls, steel shutters, a gravel roof, and a low, inward-looking shape that sat on the ridge like a stubborn piece of geology. People in Cinder Ridge called it the Burrow. The HOA called it a visual violation. Miles Cartwright, the luxury developer next door, called it a bunker for a man who had given up on beauty. 6 weeks later, when a wind-driven firestorm came off the canyons and turned the prettiest houses on the ridge into lanterns of burning glass and cedar, that bunker became the only address on the mountain where people could still breathe. And the man they had mocked became the one they had to beg. Cinder Ridge sat above a network of dry Sonoma County ravines lined with oak, chaparral, and eucalyptus. The brochure language called it elevated wine country living. The reality was simpler. It was a luxury subdivision built in a fire corridor. The lots were stunning. Long views, clean modern lines, glass corners that opened to the valley, imported cedar soffits, cantilevered decks, outdoor kitchens with polished stone counters. At twilight, the ridge looked like a string of designer lanterns hovering over the dark hills. It also sat directly above a set of steep canyons that funneled heat and wind uphill with terrifying efficiency whenever late-season fire weather lined up the wrong way. Most of the buyers saw views. Graham saw fuel, slope, ember pathways, and failure points. Graham was 69 years old, lean and compact, with a weathered face and the permanent squint of a man who had spent half his life reading danger before other people knew it was there. He had retired after 4 decades in industrial fire protection, most of it spent designing suppression systems and blast-resistant infrastructure for refineries, tank farms, and marine terminals along the Gulf Coast. He had spent his career asking one question over and over in different forms. What happens when everything goes wrong at once? That question had made him good at his job. It had also made him almost impossible to impress. When he bought Lot 8 at Cinder Ridge, the sales office showed him renderings of alpine modern homes with enormous windows and tongue-and-groove cedar ceilings. Graham smiled, thanked them, and hired a geotechnical crew instead. His house began with excavation, not elevation. He cut the building pad deeper than anyone expected, pushed the structure into the slope, then wrapped 3 sides of it in reinforced retaining walls and compacted earth. He used insulated concrete forms for the shell, poured dense, reinforced concrete inside them, and built a broad roof deck of steel and concrete, with a shallow pitch buried beneath drainage mat, gravel, and fire-rated membrane. The windows were narrow and deeply recessed. The only large openings faced inward into a protected courtyard. Every vent had stainless ember mesh. Every door was steel. Every exposed surface within 30 feet of the house was gravel, stone, or bare mineral soil. The neighbors watched the construction the way people watch someone committing a social error in public and refusing to notice. What offended them most was not that Graham's house was strange. It was that it made their houses look frivolous. By the time the roof membrane went on, the comments had turned open. At one HOA review meeting, a woman from Lot 3 said the house looked like a utility building somebody forgot to hide. Another called it a luxury survivalist compound. Miles Cartwright was blunter than either of them. Miles was 46, handsome in the deliberate way of men who know exactly what their barbers charge and exactly how their jackets fit. He had made a fortune building upscale projects around Marin and Sonoma, and he had brought that same glossy confidence to Cinder Ridge, where he had built himself a house that was half statement piece and half self-portrait. The front elevation was all glass, cedar, black steel, and height. It looked magnificent in photographs. It also had long, exposed eaves, ventilated roof lines, cedar cladding, 3 decks, a vented crawl space, and enough glass to reflect a sunrise like a signal mirror. At the August HOA meeting, Miles dropped a stack of printed property comps on the table and tapped Graham's rendering with one manicured finger. "This is not what buyers pay for up here," he said. "We built an aspirational neighborhood. He is building a dirt-colored fortress. It drags the entire visual standard down." Brenda Vale, the HOA president, tried to slow Graham with design review notices, fines, and procedural delays. But Graham had done his homework with the same cold thoroughness he used on industrial specs. The county allowed earth-sheltered construction. The setbacks were correct. The materials were compliant. The roof reflectivity met code. The fire resistance package exceeded code by a wide margin. There was nothing they could legally stop. So they mocked him instead. When the landscaping went in, the ridicule sharpened. Everyone else planted ornamental grasses, sculpted olive trees, and drought-tolerant gardens lit by uplights. Graham planted almost nothing. He thinned the native brush, removed the ornamental mulch, laid stone, installed a buried cistern, and ran dedicated hardline connections for rooftop deluge nozzles and perimeter hose bibs. He planted a few low succulents in the courtyard and left the outside looking almost bare. "It looks unfinished," Miles said one evening, standing at the property line with a glass of wine in his hand. Graham was on a ladder then, securing one of the external steel shutter tracks over a courtyard opening. "It's finished," Graham said. Miles stared at the blank, low profile of the roof. You spent all this money to build a house nobody wants to look at. Graham climbed down, set the drill on the ground, and looked out toward the canyon beyond Miles's house. The late October grass below the ridge had already gone the color of paper. Your house is built to be seen from the valley, Graham said. And yours? Mine is built to still be here when the valley comes up the hill. Miles laughed. This is Sonoma, Graham, not Fallujah. Graham didn't smile. Fire doesn't care where the zip code sits. By the first week of October, the region had gone brittle. The marine layer thinned. Humidity dropped. The hills dried into gradients of straw, rust, and dust. The forecasts began mentioning offshore wind events, then stronger offshore wind events, then the phrase, fire weather watch, in the clipped voice that professionals use when they are trying not to sound alarmed too soon. Graham noticed everything. The pressure swings, the long-range models, the way the oaks were carrying dead leaf litter under otherwise healthy canopies, the smell of dry eucalyptus in the afternoon heat, the fact that several neighbors still had decorative wood furniture stacked under overhangs and welcome mats sitting against cedar siding like tinder squares. He made one final walk of his own place the Friday before the wind event. He closed the exterior shutters, tested the ember screens, checked the backup battery wall in the utility room, ran the pump from the cistern to the roof spray manifold, cleaned the courtyard drains, filled every kettle and every tub. Then he sat in his kitchen with a yellow pad and made a simple list. Oxygen, water, heat management, visibility, exit routes, medical kit, communications. A system only looks calm, he used to tell junior engineers, because somebody already imagined the failure. The night the fire came, Miles Cartwright was hosting 12 people for a wine dinner. They had candles on the table, a chef working the induction range, music tucked low under the conversation, floor-to-ceiling glass throwing warm reflections into the dark. At 8:12 p.m., the first gust hit the ridge hard enough to shake the upper deck cables. At 8:20, the wind became a sustained force, not a weather event, a pressure event, something with mass and intention behind it. It came screaming up the canyon in hot, dry bursts that hit the ridge from below and rolled over the houses with violent turbulence. Patio furniture shifted. Deck lanterns fell. Somewhere down the street, something metal tore loose and began hammering against stone. Inside Graham's house, the noise was different. Muted, flattened, distant. The thick shell and earth berming turned the outside world into pressure without drama. He could hear the wind, but only as a low, muscular rush over the gravel roof and occasional taps against the shuttered courtyard openings. He had one lamp on in the living room, one in the hall, and the battery monitor glowing green near the utility door. A kettle rested on the stove. His portable radio sat beside it. At 8:37 p.m., County Emergency Dispatch upgraded the alert. Fast-moving wildfire east of Mark West drainage, Mandatory evacuation advisory for ridge communities. Graham stood very still and listened to the wind. A mandatory evacuation advisory would have made sense 2 hours earlier. Now it was almost theatrical. Nobody was driving safely off this ridge once the fire got close. Not in this wind. Not with ember wash ahead of the flame front. He keyed his VHF set and called on the neighborhood emergency frequency the HOA had insisted on for medical incidents and gate malfunctions. "This is Graham Voss, Lot 8. If anybody is sheltering in place, close all exterior openings. Kill your HVAC intake if you can't filter it. Get away from view windows and move to the most protected room in your structure." There was a hiss of static, then silence. Then someone laughed nervously and cut the channel. At 8:51, the power died. Miles's dining room went black except for the candles and the giant orange glow lifting behind the eastern ridgeline. One of his guests stood first. "Is that a reflection?" It wasn't. By the time Miles reached the west deck, embers were already arriving. Not ash. Embers. Burning fragments the size of coins and leaves hurled horizontally through the dark, striking the deck glass, the siding, the planters, the cushions. The canyon below no longer looked like a landscape. It looked like a furnace being tipped uphill. His wife, Claire, came up behind him. "Miles?" He turned. For the first time all night, his face had nothing polished in it, only calculation and fear. "Get everyone downstairs," he said. "Now." What happened next was not a slow loss. It was a systems failure in real time. The wind drove ember after ember into the vulnerable parts of the house, under deck boards, into roof vents, along cedar trim details, into dry ornamental grasses by the lower retaining wall. The fire didn't need the whole house at once. It only needed one successful ignition in the wrong place. The first alarm came from the garage attic heat sensor, the second from the west eave. Then the smoke control system faulted because the intake had begun pulling particulate so thick it was effectively breathing the fire. Miles hit the deluge feature on his smart home panel. Nothing happened. The private water pressure booster had already lost power with the rest of the system. The backup generator tried to pick up the load, choked on superheated smoky air, and shut itself down less than 20 seconds later. Then the lower deck furniture ignited. The glass made it horrifying. You could watch the house begin to die. A chair cushion caught first, then a cedar privacy screen. Then the underside of the deck flashed with a run of flame so sudden and fluid it looked poured. Inside, guests screamed. Someone dropped a bottle. Claire was shouting for their daughter. The chef had wrapped a wet towel over his mouth and was trying to help two elderly guests down the stairs. And above all of it was the sound no one in the room would ever forget. Sharp metallic pops from the exterior window frames as the temperature differential turned expensive glazing into stress points waiting to fail. Miles made it to the lower hall just as the first pane let go. The burst wasn't cinematic. It was violent and ugly and fast. The outer pane fractured, the pressure changed, and a sheet of embers and black-red air shoved into the room like something alive. Smoke came low and hard. The temperature jumped so quickly it felt unreal. "Out the rear mudroom!" Miles shouted. "But the cars! Forget the cars!" There are moments when pride doesn't vanish. It gets burned out of you. They stumbled into the back service corridor, half blind, pulling sleeves over faces, coughing, trying to count people in the dark. Claire had their daughter Lila by the wrist. One of the dinner guests was on the floor, vomiting from smoke. Someone yelled that the upper stair had caught. Another voice yelled that the back patio was already burning. Miles yanked open the mudroom door and stared into an ember storm. The air outside was orange-black, full of spinning firebrands and smoke ripped flat by the wind. Landscaping torches had gone down. One section of fence was already burning. Their detached guest casita, 40 feet away, was on fire at the roofline. And through that chaos, barely visible across the open space between lots, was Graham's house. No flames on the walls, no exposed eaves, no lit windows facing out. Just a low, dark shape under driving sparks, roof sprinklers pulsing in controlled arcs that turned the air above it into flashing silver mist. It looked less like a house than a thing refusing permission to burn. Miles stared at it for half a second too long. Then he understood what he was seeing, and what he had to do. "Everyone stay low," he shouted. "We go to Graham's, now. Stay together. Stay together. Nobody lets go." The run between the two houses was less than 100 yards. It felt like crossing the inside of a blast furnace. The wind hit them sideways and backward in chaotic bursts. Embers pinned themselves to clothing, hair, and sleeves. Lila screamed when one landed on the back of her neck. Claire slapped it out with her palm and shoved her forward. One dinner guest fell in the gravel and had to be dragged by both arms. Miles lost sight of the courtyard gate twice in the smoke. The decorative cypress along his own side path ignited with a whoosh that sounded like a line of paper lanterns catching all at once. They reached Graham's outer wall by touch more than sight. The entrance, recessed deep behind an angled concrete wing wall, was almost shockingly calm compared with the inferno outside. The geometry cut the wind. The concrete held the heat out just long enough to think. Miles pounded the steel door with both fists. "Graham!" No answer. He pounded again, coughing so hard his knees buckled. "Graham! Open up!" For one long second,
He thought the old man might leave them there. Then the locks clacked. 1, 2, 3. The door opened inward. Graham stood there in a headlamp and work shirt, a damp bandana around his neck, face expressionless. "Inside," he said. The group spilled into the entry airlock as Graham shut the outer door behind them and dogged it sealed. Then he opened the inner door, and the difference was so total it felt supernatural. Silence. Warmth. Clean, filtered air. Miles dropped to one knee on the polished concrete and just stared. The floor was warm. Not hot. Deeply, steadily warm. The house smelled faintly of mineral plaster, pine shelving, and something simmering on the stove. The light came from low amber fixtures running on battery backup. No smoke, no panic, no shrieking alarm panels. Only order. Claire started crying then, not theatrically, but from pure nervous collapse. Lila folded against the wall and shook. One of the guests kept saying, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" Graham moved through them with the stripped-down efficiency of someone who had rehearsed worse. "Jackets and outer layers off if they're smoking. Bench on the left. Medical bin under it. Claire, check hair and collars for ember burns. Miles, utility sink. Wet towels. Bring them back." Miles obeyed. That was the thing he would remember later. How fast humiliation can turn into obedience when competence enters the room. The interior of the house was not bunker-like in the way people had mocked. It was beautiful, but in a way that ignored fashion entirely. The main room wrapped around an open, protected courtyard. The walls were smooth lime plaster over concrete. Built-in benches lined the walls. A heavy wood table sat near the kitchen. There were no giant views outward.
The house faced itself, and because of that, it held calm the way a clenched hand holds water. Miles looked toward the utility alcove and saw the working heart of the place. Battery banks, water controls, air filtration, pump manifolds, labeled shutoffs. Every system visible, legible, intentional. Graham handed out wool blankets and foil emergency wraps. "Everyone drinks water first," he said, "then tea. Smoke and adrenaline will fool you into thinking you're fine." Miles took the mug Graham handed him and couldn't quite meet his eyes. Graham spared him the mercy of not forcing the moment. Outside, something heavy collapsed with a low, rushing boom. Nobody in the room had to ask whose house it might have been. Then the radio crackled. "Anyone on Ridge Channel? Anyone? This is Brenda Vale." Every head turned. Graham crossed the room and leaned over the set. "This is Graham Voss, Lot 8. Say again." Static. Then clearer. "The south wall held, but the upper deck came through the family room. Nolan's trapped. I can't move the beam. The sprinklers failed. Smoke in the lower hall. Please." Miles felt his stomach drop. Brenda's house sat 2 switchbacks higher on the ridge, more exposed than any other property in Cinder Ridge. Nolan was a big man, and if something had pinned him, it was something serious. Claire looked at Miles. Miles looked at Graham. Graham was already moving. He went to the gear closet and opened it. Inside were Nomex coveralls, smoke goggles, half-mask respirators, leather gloves, webbing straps, pry bars, a compact hydraulic jack, trauma supplies, and 2 folded fire shelters. Miles stared at the equipment. "You planned for this?" "I planned for something," Graham said. "Specifics are a luxury." He tossed one set of coveralls at Miles. It hit his chest and dropped to the floor. Graham looked at him. "Nolan's trapped under load. I can jack and brace, but I'm not hauling him alone in that wind." Miles's face tightened. "You want me to go back out there?" Graham zipped his own suit halfway and checked the respirator seals with practiced hands. "I want a second set of hands with enough strength to matter." For a moment, the room held perfectly still. Miles looked at Claire. She had one hand on Lila's shoulder, and soot streaked across one cheek. She was terrified. And she still gave him a tiny nod. That was enough. He picked up the suit. The world outside the steel door had worsened. The fire front itself had moved past the lower canyon, but what replaced it on the ridge was almost more dangerous. Sustained ember storm, structure fires, superheated turbulent wind, and visibility that came and went in violent, smoky pulses. Burning fragments skated across the ground. One neighboring house had collapsed inward, sending a pillar of sparks up like a signal flare. Graham clipped a tether line between them before they left the entry alcove. "If one of us goes down, the other doesn't keep walking. Stay on hardscape when you can. Avoid vegetation. Avoid vehicles. If I say drop, you drop." Miles nodded. They stepped out. The heat outside was not uniform. One second, cold wind drove through the canyon cut. The next, a wave of radiant heat hit from a burning deck or wall and made exposed skin sting through fabric. Smoke ran low, then high. Sparks moved against gravity. Brenda's house was half visible through it all. One wing burning, one wing dark. The center punched open where the upper deck had collapsed into the family room. They made it to the rear service entry by hugging a stone retaining wall and ducking beneath a line of ornamental pears that were beginning to torch one by one. Inside, the house had become a ruin of luxury materials. Stone counters covered in drywall dust, broken pendant lights, a smell of wet plaster, burned insulation, and expensive wood finishing turning toxic in heat. Brenda was in the lower den, coughing, one sleeve torn, face blackened with soot. She had both hands on a section of shattered beam and was trying to move it by rage alone. Nolan lay pinned beneath the collapsed edge of a laminated support member, dragged down by the deck failure above. One leg was twisted wrong below the knee. The other was trapped under a secondary load of framing and stone veneer. Graham dropped beside him, eyes moving fast. Pulse? Fast, Brenda said. He keeps fading. Graham looked once at the load path and knew what mattered. If we lift the wrong side, the veneer stack rolls, he said. Then he dies. Miles swallowed. What do you need? Graham pointed. Jack under that bearing edge. Not center. Bearing edge. Then I want cribbing. There is no cribbing. There is now. He shoved a handsaw and a pry tool at Miles and pointed to a shattered built-in bench. Cut those lengths, fast. Miles did exactly what he was told. Brenda held the light. Graham set the jack. The beam groaned as pressure came onto the piston. Pump, Graham said. Miles pumped. Once. Twice. Again. Nolan screamed when the load shifted. That was good. Screaming meant consciousness. Again. Click. Again. Click. Graham drove the first block into place with the heel of his hand, then the second. More. The room above them made a deep, unstable sound. Not a crash, a warning. Brenda heard it too. Her face changed. Graham didn't look up. If it starts to come, you drag him by the shoulders and do not stop. They got another inch, then another. Now! Brenda and Miles hauled Nolan clear, while Graham kicked the jack base sideways and rolled with the collapsing debris as a shower of lath, plaster, and stone slammed down where Nolan's legs had been a second earlier. The whole lower den filled with dust and hot grit. They moved on instinct after that. Webbing under Nolan's arms, a salvaged rug folded under his hips as a drag sheet. Brenda coughing blood-flecked spit into her sleeve. Miles grunting under Nolan's weight. Graham leading by the tether and flashlight beam, choosing the least bad path through a house that had become a maze of heat and failure. The trip back down the ridge took nearly an hour. Twice they had to stop and flatten themselves behind masonry while flame rolled across a neighboring deck above them. Once Nolan went limp enough that Brenda thought he had died. He hadn't. He was in shock and dropping. When the dark, low line of Graham's house emerged through the smoke again, Miles felt something that was too raw to be gratitude and too deep to be relief alone. It was reverence. They got the door shut behind them, and with that single mechanical sound, the worst of the world stopped. Inside, the house absorbed them. Warmth, filtered air, light, order. Claire and the others helped get Nolan onto the heated floor near the medical kit. Graham splinted both legs as best he could, controlled the bleeding, checked airway and pupils, then finally sat back on his heels and exhaled for the first time anyone had seen. No one said much after that. The house did what it had been built to do. It held people alive until morning. At dawn, the wind dropped. Not all at once. It unwound. The screaming in the canyons lowered to a rush. The rush thinned to gusts. Then the ridge went still enough that ash began falling straight down. Graham opened the outer door carefully and stepped into a morning so clear and blue it looked indecent after the night that had come before it. Miles followed him out. The devastation was total. Cinder Ridge no longer looked expensive. It looked archaeological. Burned-out decks hung loose over blackened slopes. Window walls had burst and vented interiors to flame. Cedar cladding had peeled away in curled black sheets. Roof lines had collapsed into angular nests of carbon and steel. Vehicles sat melted into driveways. Outdoor kitchens were heaps of fractured stone. Miles looked at the place where his own house had stood. Nothing remained that could still be called a home. Then he turned and looked at Graham's. The gravel roof was damp but intact. The outer walls were smoke-stained but untouched. The steel shutters were closed on the outward-facing sides, open toward the courtyard. The perimeter gravel bed was littered with dead embers that had gone out with nowhere to feed. The house had not beaten the fire. It had denied the fire anything useful. Graham stood with a mug of coffee in one hand, shoulders slightly bowed with fatigue. Miles took a long breath and said the hardest thing he had said in years. I was wrong. Graham kept looking over the ridge. Yes. No cruelty, no triumph, just accuracy. Miles swallowed. I mocked this house. I tried to stop you from building it. And last night, my family lived because you ignored me. Graham finally looked at him. A house is not a sculpture, he said. It's a system for keeping conditions on the inside different from conditions on the outside. People forget that when money gets involved. The visual contrast was irresistible in the days that followed. A ridge of destroyed luxury homes, and in the middle of it, one low, earth-sheltered concrete house with smoke on its walls and people alive inside it. News helicopters filmed it from above. Architectural websites wrote breathless reassessments. Fire-hardening consultants pointed at the roof, the defensible space, the ember-resistant details, the inward-facing openings, the non-combustible perimeter, and the independent water and power systems, and said the same thing in different language. This wasn't luck. This was design. The HOA changed faster than the ridge recovered. Brenda resigned before Thanksgiving. The design committee was dissolved soon after. The covenants that had privileged height, view glazing, exposed timber detailing, and ornamental landscaping over survivability were stripped back and rewritten around hardening standards, defensible space, and materials performance. For once, aesthetics had lost a fight to physics. When Miles rebuilt on the same lot the following year, he did not call the glossy architecture firm that had designed his first house. He walked next door instead. I need help, he said.
Graham looked up from the courtyard workbench. With the design? With the part where it stays standing. That finally got the ghost of a smile out of the old man. By the end of that afternoon, the new concept had no cedar eaves, no unprotected glazing wall, no vented attic, no ornamental vegetation near the shell, and no deck that could act as a fuel package against the structure. It was still beautiful, but beauty had been forced to answer harder questions first. As for Graham, he never became what journalists wanted him to become. He did not go on a speaking tour. He did not launch a consulting brand. He did not stand in front of cameras and call himself vindicated. He just kept living in the house they had hated until they needed it. And that is why the story stayed. Not because a smug neighborhood got punished. Not because one man was smarter than everyone else. But because Graham Voss understood something expensive communities often forget. A beautiful object is not the same thing as a functional shelter. An impressive house is not the same thing as a survivable one. And nature has a brutal way of stripping the difference down to first principles. If you build for applause, you inherit the weakness of whatever audience you wanted to impress.
If you build for reality, reality may someday return the favor. On Cinder Ridge, the ugliest house became the only honest one. And when the hill turned orange, and the wind started throwing fire uphill faster than money could react, honesty was the only luxury that mattered.